Good evening and good morning to all of our participants, and thank you all for joining us today for this discussion on the opportunities for decarbonizing the power sectors in the United States and China. I am Bob Weismiller. I'm a research affiliate with the California-China Climate Institute and will be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. I'll offer a few housekeeping remarks before we begin. We are recording this event, and it will later be available on the California-China Climate Institute's website and YouTube channel. This event is being simultaneously translated into Mandarin Chinese. Please use the globe icon at the base of your screen to select the preferred language you would like to listen to, either English or Mandarin. Throughout today's discussion, if you'd like to ask a question of one of our panelists, please type your question into the Q&A function at the base of your screen at any time. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can during today's program. Now let's go ahead and get started. Today's discussion is one of the broader series we've been exploring at the California-China Climate Institute, focused on opportunities for the US and China to take additional climate actions within the 2020s on key topics within the Glasgow Declaration signed at COP26. In association, we have launched an 11-paper series. Look at our website under US-China paper series, focused on the various aspects of this issue. Today, we are focusing on one of these key areas, power sector decarbonization, and on a recent report, Decarbonizing the Power Sector in the US and China, which focuses on this topic. We have here today the report's authors, as well as some additional experts in power sector reform, to have a discussion about the opportunities they see on the horizon for the two nations. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our expert panel. First, to talk about the context here in the United States, we have two US-based experts. First, Michael O'Boyle is a Senior Director, Electricity at Energy Innovation. Mike directs the firm's electricity program, which focuses on designing and quantifying the impacts of policies needed to affordably and reliably decarbonize the US electricity grid. He focuses on designing and quantifying the impacts of policies needed to decarbonize the US electricity grid, including clean electricity standards, wholesale market design, monopoly, utility regulation, and energy efficiency policies. Second, we have Max Dupuy as a principal and program director at the Regulatory Assistance Project, where he leads and manages initiatives in China regarding the power sector and transition to a lower carbon future. He specializes in comparative analysis of energy policy and has particular experience with China's energy institutions and challenges. And to share more about the context in China, we have two China-based issues experts. First, Yuan Yahua is a professor of management science at the North China Electric Power University, where he focuses on China's power sector transition with an emphasis on coal. He has published extensively in the academic literature and in policy reports and the media on the low carbon transition. Second, we have Tang Dan, who's an assistant professor at Tsinghua University, specializing in atmospheric sciences. Her research focuses on global anthropogenic progenic emissions, the synergy between carbon neutrality and air pathways, as well as system monitoring and analysis. We'll start with you, Mike, and then proceed in the order I just mentioned.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought we were starting with Max?
I'm happy to, I think mine is the framing presentation, so I'm happy.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I will do that now. Okay, greetings. You should be able to see my screen now. And thanks to the California-China Climate Institute for hosting this event. Very glad to be here today. As the first speaker, thanks, Mike, for that. I'm going to step back and offer a broad comparative framework to facilitate our discussion today. Now, there are many ways in which energy systems in China and the US, of course, are quite different. There's different institutional contexts, there's different historical details, different resource profiles, and of course, different details on how policies are designed and implemented. But the point I'd like to make in my brief presentation today is that at a high level, there are actually many common policy challenges that both countries face as they look to decarbonize their respective power sectors. And these are, in fact, works in progress. In my brief presentation, I'm just going to quickly illuminate some of the broad similarities between the two countries. I'm going to draw on the work of RAP's team in China and the US, and as well as my own years of working on these policy issues in both countries. Now, for an overview discussion, it's useful to start with a graphic like this that many of you have seen before, showing how the different parts of any clean energy system will need to work together. This one's from the US Department of Energy from a few years ago. China's NEA actually just issued a report, a blueprint for the power sector that has a very similar figure. But the key idea for this type of graphic is that as part of the transition, there's a need to create an integrated system in any power system where each piece of the puzzle plays its part in a flexible way to support a system with high amounts of variable renewable energy, chiefly wind and solar. And that's a work in progress right now on the ground in China and on the ground in the US. So let me break this down to illuminate just a few common themes. These themes are somewhat titled differently than what we used in the report, but I think this will be a good framework for the discussion today. The first theme common to both countries that I'll highlight is perhaps the obvious one: change the resource mix, build out clean and retire fossil. The second theme common to both countries is the need to build a transmission network suitable to integrate large amounts of renewable energy. The third common policy challenge is to have broad geographic markets to optimize that grid on an hour-by-hour and minute-by-minute basis. And the fourth challenge I'll highlight today is the need for time-varying prices to unlock demand-side flexibility. Now, these are not the only ingredients for the power sector transition, but they're four that both countries share and that are extremely important. So I'll go through each of these in turn. The first one, adjusting the resource mix, building out clean and retiring fossil. Now, both countries are actually, there's a lot going on in terms of investment in clean energy resources. I'm going to focus on this slide in the issue of retiring fossil-fired generation, because that's perhaps the most difficult, immediate, near-term issue. Common factors for both countries: the cost of solar and wind capacity for several years now has been below or at least near the fuel costs for fossil-fired plants. There are different estimates, but it's pretty clear this is true in both countries. And that means that it's cheaper to build new wind and solar capacity than actually just buy the fuel, the coal and the gas for traditional power plants. And that's a very big factor for both countries. Now, markets and policies as designed are not necessarily transmitting that economic reality. And this is true to varying degrees within each country. Different regions within each country have different characteristics in terms of how the markets and policies are working. But to some extent, investors and other decision makers are still insulated from that economic reality. Now, in the US, coal power has been retiring for quite a number of years, but there are significant lagging regions, as I think Mike will mention in a little bit more detail, the Southeast and the West in particular. We are seeing continued build out of gas-fired generation. Now, it's possible that this will be eventually fueled with an alternative clean fuel, or there'll be carbon capture, but it looks like this continued build out is inconsistent with the with the targets for decarbonizing the power sector in the next within the next decade. And this is, although gas does admittedly currently play a very important part in providing flexibility in the system. In China, as many of the audience knows, there's a continued build out of coal-fired generation. They're in the wake of the major power crises that hit the country in 2021, 2022, and there are concerns about further tightness in the system in 2023 with the heat wave. In the wake of those crises, there's been an approval of large amounts of new coal-fired generation capacity. Now, whether or not this actually comes into operations, is actually built, depends on many factors and many policies. Two I'd like to highlight are the mechanisms that influence how coal power is compensated. And there are two key mechanisms that our team is watching closely and that many people in China are watching. One is the on-grid coal price mechanism, which has been reformed in recent years to a large extent, but is still at the center of how coal power and other generation is compensated. There's also a policy that's been initiated by the central government recently, capacity payments, which is a per kilowatt hour policy of compensation for generators. That's under development, it's under consideration, details still unclear. We've seen that quite a bit in other countries as a controversial topic. It can be designed well. It can also be designed poorly and slow down the retirement of fossil fired resources in a costly way. Second topic that I'm talking about today, which is common to both countries, is the need to build transmission grid resources or transmission grid network particularly suited to integrating renewables. And this is true in both countries. In the US, unfortunately, it is a hot topic, but there's slow permitting and interconnection processes. There's a lot of renewable generation proposed projects that would like to be interconnected, and there's a long waiting list. There's weak progress with interregional transmission planning and investments. There are initiatives with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, possible legislation as well that may help solve some of these projects, but there'll be problems, but they'll be with us for a while. In China, there's been years of strong investment in the transmission network. That includes large investments in long distance, ultra high voltage transmission. That's the kind of transmission that a lot of studies, including the US, looking at the clean energy scenarios in the US, call for that kind of investment in ultra high voltage transmission, but has been thin on the ground in the US. Quite a lot of investments in China. There are some questions about inefficiency in planning. Are the right resources in China being built in the right places to support renewable energy, and are they being utilized in an optimal fashion? That last point brings me to my next common theme, is that once you have the grid, or as the grid is being built out, it's necessary to optimize that on an hour by hour, minute by minute basis. And that usually means having broad geographic markets and that help optimize the system and balance that renewable energy across great distances. Now, in the US, there's long experience with the so-called ISO RTO markets, and those have been documented. They've brought substantial benefits to the approximately 2/3 of the country that are covered by these markets. And it's included reduced consumer costs, reduced emissions, better integration of renewable energy. Some parts of the US, chiefly, again, the Southeast and the Western parts, don't have these ISO RTO markets, but they are developing market mechanisms that, at least in principle, play a similar function. And the West is arguably further along. In China, the central government's economic planning body, the National Development Reform Commission, in 2022 called for a national unified electricity market system. There's been about 5 years, maybe 7 years of building so-called provincial level spot market pilots, which are essentially analogous to the ISO RTO markets that I just mentioned in the US. and operate at the provincial level. Now, it's a big step forward that NDRC is calling for this national unified electricity market system. The details, I think, are still under debate. There's a big challenge of binding the spot markets into truly unified, either multi-province regional or possibly an actual national spot market that will effectively support renewable energy integration. This is something that we'll be developing in coming years. And the fourth topic I will mention that's common to both countries is the need for time-varying pricing to unlock that demand-side flexibility. A colleague of mine points to demand-side flexibility in a recent paper and says this is the potential mother lode of low-cost, flexible resources. It really can be a big boon to integration of renewables into the clean energy transition. One important ingredient, there's a lot of ingredients to getting that demand-side flexibility right, but one important ingredient is time-varying rate designs. Ideally, consumers and users are paying lower prices when wind and solar is plentiful and higher prices when it is not, to encourage shifting of EV charging and other end uses. Now, in the US, it's an old idea, time of use pricing. Coverage has been expanding. There's been a lot of work being done, including in California. But overall, looking at the country as a whole, I think it's fair to say it's somewhat slow. It's a state-by-state process, so it really depends on bandwidth and interest and momentum at the state level. In China, seen big expansion. There's a 2021 policy on time of use electricity pricing that required these rates for virtually all consumers nationally. Now, there's still work to be done. The provinces have been responsible for implementing this, and there's arguably a need to refine the design of these prices so that they do reflect the conditions on the system hour by hour in a more accurate way. And they need to be, like in any country, they need to be updated as the system changes, as renewables grow on the grid, and as more and more electric vehicles and other electrified end uses come to the grid. So with that, I will look forward to what my colleagues have to say about these topics, and I look forward to a great discussion. We have much more on these themes on or many of these themes on our RAP website, and I welcome the audience to visit us there. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to the next speaker.
Hi there. Okay, let me share my screen. There we go. Okay, is that looking good to everybody? I'll just assume it is, if no, and someone will tell me otherwise. All right, so thank you, Max, for that great introduction. I'll just mention, I think a link was shared to this specific paper that Max and I worked on last year. A lot has actually changed since that paper was published, and so I'm going to focus my discussion on specific developments in the US that are relevant to this discussion of how to decarbonize the electricity sector. A comprehensive discussion of this is impossible in the time that we have allotted, so I'll try to hone in on some of the most significant developments and leave the paper as something folks can read for greater detail, as well as other resources. So the big development in the United States in the last year has been the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. This is legislation passed in 2022, championed by the Biden administration, that provides lots and lots of financial incentives, basically subsidies for clean energy technologies that will be the primary drivers of emissions reductions in the United States, especially in the electricity sector, where most of the money is being spent to support clean energy technologies. So these are two graphics by separate independent energy analysis firms that analyze the impact of this Inflation Reduction Act on the electricity sector in the United States. And they're trying to forecast how it will change the makeup of the electricity sector. So on the right, you see a forecast by the Rhodium Group. They forecast a central case of 76% carbon-free electricity. That's mostly growth in wind and solar generation. You can see the business as usual case was 58%. So that's about a 20% increase in clean energy generation by 2030. My firm, Energy Innovation, also has a policy simulator that we use to model the same question. And we came to a similar conclusion that the Inflation Reduction Act would push US electricity system to a roughly 75% carbon-free generation, up from its current percentage of about 41% in 2022. So that's really rapid growth in renewable generation. On the left, you can see that implies adding almost 900 gigawatts. Just for reference, we don't even have 300 gigawatts today. So it's a huge addition of renewable capacity. But the models, right, they're looking at what is the least cost electricity mix in the United States under this policy, where wind power, solar power, batteries, nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration, all of these low or zero carbon technologies are receiving huge subsidies. So now they're the cheapest resource. However, many of these models don't have particularly, they've not examined the limitations of the grid or other institutional barriers that now stand as the biggest challenge to achieving these carbon reductions in the near term. So I'll spend some time discussing what a lot of those barriers are, building on the helpful framing that Max laid out. The good news is, as Max mentioned, wind and solar resources, new wind and solar resources, are now cheaper than the cost of operating existing coal-fired power plants in the United States. Energy Innovation did an analysis looking at every coal-fired power plant in the US and found that 99% of them, all but one, are more expensive to operate on a going forward basis when compared to the all-in energy costs of new local wind and solar resources. So this is not just replacing the coal-fired generation and transmitting it through the grid. It means that there are resources and potentially jobs and tax and local economic development opportunities near those coal-fired power plants. The Inflation Reduction Act also provides incentives to site clean energy infrastructure at or near retired coal-fired power plants or coal mining communities. So it further reduces the cost of replacing coal-fired power plants with local clean energy resources. And it can also, the savings from replacing coal with clean are sufficient in many cases to finance additional energy storage resources that can provide additional value and potentially bolster local reliability. The Inflation Reduction Act, I know I've listed a lot of things, but one other thing it has for utilities is government-backed loan guarantees. So if a utility wants to replace a coal-fired power plant with a clean resource portfolio, it can access up to $250 billion in aggregate of government-backed loans that can offer interest rates that are similar to the US Treasury rate. So very low cost financing, even in this high inflation environment, available for utilities that want to transition. So the US really passed a comprehensive package of financial incentives that make it cheaper and easier to transition. So implementing federal subsidies is still complicated in the US federalist system, because states have so much jurisdiction over the electricity sector. States have pretty exclusive jurisdiction over the resource mix of that serve customers, and every state has a public utility commission that dictates what investments their monopoly utilities can make. So implementing the Inflation Reduction Act isn't just a matter of letting the market work, it also means scrutinizing the investment plans and working with utilities that actually need permission to access the incentives available to them. It also means picking up the pace of renewable deployment at a time when the grid itself is not necessarily equipped to handle rapid onboarding and interconnection of clean energy resources. And I'll highlight that a bit in a slide later. And then there's planning for and investing in grid expansion, something that has really stalled out in recent years in the United States. We haven't built any meaningful interregional transmission that's high voltage in about a decade or more. And we're going to have to find ways. There are some tools in recent legislation that may help that, but institutions and regulations need to evolve to make that easier and faster. And then there are communities that are adversely affected by fossil retirements, and unless the new resource investments are targeted toward some of those communities, and then also opportunities are given to communities that have suffered from historical local pollution burdens. The political will for the clean energy transition could be threatened, and already there are coal-heavy states, for example, that are really resisting their utilities accessing the incentives that they want to access in the Inflation Reduction Act. States like West Virginia, I think Utah, and some others have actually told their utilities not to retire coal, to continue investing in pollution controls for those plants and continue operating them well beyond when the utilities actually want to. And then, of course, there are new pollution standards that the Biden administration has been issuing on fossil fuel power plants, both existing coal and gas, and also new standards for gas that came out 2 months ago. And those standards will be crucial drivers for decisions for how fast utilities want to transition and what investments they make. So just to crystallize how things are going in certain parts of the country with interconnecting wind and solar resources, and for those that are not grid policy wonks, what I'm talking about is basically when a new generator wants to provide power to the grid and sell it into, say, a wholesale market, or sell it directly to a large customer that wants it, they have to request permission to interconnect to the grid. And generally there's a utility or a regional transmission organization that says, okay, you can do that, but here are the investments you need to pay for to upgrade the grid so that it can handle your power. And generally, you can think of the grid as a highway in this analogy, where the generators need to pay for the on-ramp, but sometimes there are needs to upgrade the highway itself, to add lanes to the highway so that more energy can move through. And those are very expensive upgrades. Right now, we don't have good ways for allocating those costs. So if you're next in line and we need to upgrade the highway, you end up needing to bear the entirety of those costs. And that ends up being very discouraging to new generators that want to interconnect. So we have a failure to proactively plan and upgrade the grid, and we have outdated interconnection policies that make it hard to pay for these things equitably. So as you can see in the mid-continent independent system operator, these interconnection costs have ballooned in recent years. Just for context, the wind costs on the left at $400 a kilowatt, that's about a third of the total project costs. So we're talking about adding a lot of costs to a project where generally the technology is improving, costs have come down, but these barriers remain. And so we really need to fix our interconnection and planning processes. Another hot issue in the United States, and I know it is in China, is grid reliability. There have been some questions about the future reliability of the grid from the main entity that accounts for and enforces reliability standards. This is the CEO of that entity. It's the National Electric or North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. And he mentioned 3 priorities in a recent speech to Congress that need to be addressed. He mentioned that we have to manage the pace of the transformation in an orderly way. So this is a big planning problem where we need to look into the future, we being the transmission and sort of utility industry, and coordinate both among states and federal agencies, and sort of create an orderly plan where we coordinate the transmission investments that are needed with the generation technologies that are coming online and that customers want, that are cheap. So that's challenge number 1. Right now, we're not doing a good job of that. We're having a sort of disorderly transition, which has led to some worry that we are facing imminent reliability challenges, not to mention all the load growth that's coming from electrification. The second, we have to identify new resources to replace retiring generation. So coal, as Max mentioned, is coming offline, and will probably continue to do so because it's not economically viable. But with that interconnection challenge that I discussed earlier, we don't have the resources coming online to replace that generation fast enough. And so we've got things falling off the system without figuring out the timeline and the portfolios that need to replace them. So we have to do a much better job of adding things quickly and having those in place so that we don't worry about the reliability benefits that we lose from those fossil power plants. And then finally, we have to evolve the way we think about reliability. So the metrics for reliability that we have in this country are quickly becoming outdated. So heuristics like it's called like a reserve margin. These are not reliable metrics for reliability in a system that's dominated by variable renewable energy. So we need to take into account that variability. We need to do a better job of accounting for weather in our reliability metrics, in sort of the new operating paradigm with lots more storage. This is a sort of complex topic, but it really needs to be addressed. So the final point I want to make here is these are not mainly technical limitations. These are problems that require new institutional approaches. This is a very pithy summary of how we keep pace with our international and domestic climate commitments in the electricity sector. We need to update the way we plan our bulk power system to reflect these new cost and policy realities and meet this reliability moment we're in. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has several ongoing investigations or rulemakings on transmission, interconnection, transmission planning. Those need to go. Those need to be very, very ambitious, and it's not clear whether they will be finished anytime soon or sort of come out with the bold vision that's really needed right now. And states also have to play their part in updating these rules. These states also need to integrate these new cost realities into the way they regulate their utilities. There are huge consumer benefits and savings available to if we adopt these technologies, wind, solar, storage, more quickly. But updating that cost information in a regulatory environment and getting those investments planned and through that process is slow. And it needs the ambition of utilities and regulators needs to pick up. We need to do a better job of connecting fossil fuel dependent communities with the tools in the Inflation Reduction Act that bring investments in clean energy. Colorado has a great model for this. They have a just transition office that helps communities get hooked up with incentives and create transition plans where they can have a viable economic future that doesn't involve fossil fuels. And finally, the Environmental Protection Agency needs to finalize their strong health-based pollution rules for fossil power plants, which complements the Inflation Reduction Act as a regulatory stick to all the carrots that are available, and the incentives that are available from the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's a quick snapshot of what we need to accomplish. Thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
很高兴参加今天的这个讨论。刚才前面2位专家的发言，我也非常感同身受。也在很多观点上都很同意啊。因为时间原因，我没有来得及准备一个 PPT， 我就做一个非常简短的一个分享吧。我的主题是讨论中国电力系统快速脱碳的一些机遇。那么我们先看一下事实。实际上，中国进入“十四五”以来，新能源的发展应该说是要远远快于我们的预期。那么，习主席是承诺我们到2030年，风光的装机规模达到12亿千瓦。那么事实是呢，是到今年年底的时候，中国的风光装机就会突破9亿千瓦。那么再有“十四五”后2年的时间，也就是说到2025年的时候，中国就有可能，不是有可能，就是完全会实现风光的规模突破12亿千瓦。那么如果要 look ahead 就展望到2030年的话，那实际上我们看很有可能中国2030年风光的装机规模会突破20亿千瓦，所以这是一个非常显著的一个进展。那么在这个进程当中呢，实际上中国的这些进入双碳之后的一些政策，有力的驱动了我们的发展。比如说这个我们提出了在“十四五”期间要建设4.5亿千瓦的沙漠戈壁的风光大基地。那么另外一个呢，我们也很欣喜的看到，在“十四五”的前2年，中国的新能源装机，特别是光伏装机的70%到80%的增量，其实是来自于中东部地区的这种分布式光伏。也就是说，实际上受经济性比较的这样的优势的一种体现，这个风光在这个资源在这个复合中心这个就近开发、就近消纳的这样的一个速度正在加速。那么另外一方面呢，我们可以也看到这个，尤其是2021年中国大规模缺煤限电之后，那么引发了政府对于这个需求侧管理的更加的一个重视。所以中国也是在前一段时间中国的国家发改委那么修订了我们的需求侧管理办法，在征求意见。那么这里面提到了很多非常新的让我们觉得非常振奋的一些方面。比如说，首先是要求需求响应要实现规模化和常态化的一个应用，然后呢更加强调通过市场机制来实现这个需求侧的这样规模化应用。那么特别提到了这个需要通过这个比如说容量的机制，包括辅助服务的一些办法，辅助服务的一些产品的设计，来让这个需求侧更有效的无障碍的进入市场。那么这里边我们可以看到可预见的是，在未来1到2年，中国会修订我们关于电力规划、电力调度和市场的一些相应的规则，来让需求侧更好的参与到这个电力平衡，帮助中国的电力系统脱碳。然后另外一方面呢，就是这个储能和抽蓄的这个作用和它的这个重视程度，在中国也得到了前所未有的加强。首先，我们去年出台了一个储能的中长期抽水蓄能的中长期的发展规划，提出了非常有雄心的这种抽水蓄能的发展目标。因为我们看到这个电化学储能在中国发展也非常快。首先是在我们新能源的电源侧，我们要求这个每个新能源场站要配15%到20%，一般是2个小时时长的这种储能。但是我们也看到当然这一块的一个储能的配置实际上是受这个经济性的一些影响，是有一些挑战的。但另外一方面，我们可以看到，在一些这个用户侧的价格，特别是峰谷价差比较高的一些省份，比如说像浙江， 我们也看到在用户侧的这种分布式的储能，而且特别大规模的分布式的储能得到了非常快速的这样一个发展。另外一方面就是中国在去年开始推这个绿电和绿证的这样一个交易，就是中国的2大交易中心，北京中心和广州中心都已经制定了相应的办法，然后已经开始实施绿电和绿证的这个交易。那么这是我想说的，是中国从近1-2年的一些实际的变化来看一些趋势和这个中国电力部门快速脱碳所有的一些机遇吧。那么同时我也想讲一些挑战，也可能是我们很多美国的朋友，包括智库界的朋友比较关心的。比如说，首先是中国的煤电的装机仍然在核准和扩张当中。我看到那个对问题框里边有一位朋友就在问中国为什么还在继续新建煤电，我想也想简单谈一下我个人的认识。那么首先这里面有一个非常重要的因素，就是刚才其实 Max 和 Mike 都提到了，就是说中国这2年在国内关于电力安全和资源充裕度有非常多的讨论。2021年中国大规模的缺煤限电之后，就是引发了中国的最高层决策层对于这个电力安全的这样一个担忧。那么22年的话，因为这个西南长时间的高温干旱缺水，导致这个四川的水电减发了在丰水期减发了50%，然后引发了这个四川省的持续的这种缺电。那么这样一来的话，实际上这个我们的决策者，特别是主管部门和地方政府，对这个电力安全保供提到了前所未有的一个高度。那么我们特别寄希望于，比如说通过需求响应、通过储能和通过其他的这种可调度的、安全可靠的这样一些电源技术来替代煤电。但确实呢，在短的现阶段短期当中，想要完全替代煤电是非常非常困难的。比如说2023年我们东电联预测中国的这个最大负荷的增长会达到8000万千瓦，但是我们这个其他的这个可靠电源，比如说核电和少量的水电和天然气发电的这个装机规模，也就是这些是可靠的电源装机规模，一年不会超过2000万千瓦。那么这里面实际上还是有巨大的满足这个尖峰负荷的这样一个这个装机的一个缺口。那么所以在这样一个情况之下呢，这个我们的这种决策者非常会自然而然的会把这个着力点放在这个近期我们就可以快速启动的这样一个煤电的装机上去。那么这里面也要看到一个新的变化，我们不能简单的把 capacity 等同于 generation， 然后也再等同于这个叫二氧化碳的排放。那么这里面实际上刚才讲到了，我们实际上就是这个“十四五”的前2年，除了前3年，除了“十四五”前2-3年吧，就是除了2021年这个电力负荷增长特别快，实际上我们中国已经实现了这个新能源至少满足60%以上的新增的电量。所以呢，实际上我们团队包括国内的一些机构，有些研究也表明，实际上中国燃煤发电的电量峰值很可能会在2025年到28年之间就有可能会实现。那么这个峰值的电量呢，在现在的5.2万亿度电，就是5200 t 瓦时这样一个基础之上呢，可能还有300到400 t 瓦时的这样一个增量。那么也就是说，实际上中国在继续新建煤电的主要的目的是在保最大负荷，同时给新能源提供调节能力。但这里面可能会产生一些新的悖论，比如说在一个煤电装机越来越多的这样一个电力系统当中，实际上系统整个是变得更加的不灵活。尽管从这个保证资源充裕度的角度来说，我们的这个应对这个符合不确定性，或者说新能源出力不确定性的这种能力可能在增强，但所以这里面实际上存在这个转型经济性和这个安全之间的一个权衡的一个问题。那么另外一方面呢，所以呢，我们另外一方面就是我们相应的市场机制，也就是说让煤电更多的从这个发电转向少发电，提供这个调节能力和安全备用这样一个角色转变所对应的这个电力市场的这个机制和规则还没有相应的跟进和完善，所以这实际上也是一个非常大的一个挑战。另外一方面，如果从现实的问题上来看，比如说这个 我们在西部要推进沙沟荒的大基地的建设啊，大基地的建设呢，一般也会要配这个，比如说一个800万千伏的直流的项目，我们要配这个1000到1200万的这个新能源的装机，然后一般会标准的要配400万的煤电，然后同时要求呢有一个100万千瓦，然后2个小时时长的这样一个储能的这样一个容量。那么之所以这样配置呢，是首先要保证这个特高压通道它要有一个合理的一个利用率，同时呢也要保证这个新能源的利用的水平要不低于90%。那么这就带来一个问题，就是把这些资源都配在一起的时候，那么特别是加上储能之后，那实际上这个从沙沟荒送出来的电送到比如说东部的复合中心，像山东或者江苏，它的这个电价可能会高于在山东或者江苏本省的这个上网电价，那么这就带来一个经济性的一个挑战。那么同时还有一些这个调度层面的一些挑战。那所以呢，这里面就考验就实际上现在这个大基地建设的这样一个工作，可能会倒逼中国未来的区域电力市场的这个建设啊，这恰恰是中国从2015年启动新一轮电力体制改革之后，区域电力市场的建设的思路迟迟还没有特别明确的思路，没有明确的这个规则，和这个如何破局这样的一个进展。那么另外一方面呢，就是这个我们看到了分布式光伏已经成为这个光伏发展的一个主力，但是这个分布式光伏如何交易和进一步的规模化发展，同时这个分布式光伏，比如说如何更好的整合组合侧的需求响应的能力，比如说和电动汽车如何结合，这个，然后呢，如何这个通过分布式的交易来实现这种能源自主或者说能源社区的这样的这种建设。那我们应该看到，实际上中国在这个利用这个配电网络，快速的实施这个从自下而上的来帮中国的电力系统实施脱碳这样的一个进展，实际上还是非常非常缓慢的。中国在上一个月这个推出了第3轮的输配电价监审的这样一个规则，那么业内普遍认为这个监审的规则是真正的实现了我们电网公司这个仅仅靠这个输配电价这个来生存啊，完全告别过去的这种所谓的这个就是这个沃尔玛这种超市这种零售模式，也就是它不再靠这个购售电的价差来盈利。但另外一方面就是说，我们利用配电网络自下而上的这种bottom up 的这种把配电网平台化当成一个分布式交易的这样一个平台，这样的工作的进展还远远不足。那么再一点呢，就是我们也去年也启动了绿电和绿证的交易。但是我们目前可以看到，从供应侧的角度来说，我们的这个很多新能源企业还不太愿意把这个他们的新能源发电通过绿电绿证的方式这个来单独交易。那么另外一方面呢，就是说从购买方的角度来说，目前在中国购买绿电和绿证的一些主体，主要是一些要参与全球供应链，或者说一些领先的跨国公司，他们有参加 RE100，就是这个全产业链要这个使用绿电的这样一个承诺。那么相应的呢，就是大部分的工商业用户的主体，他们购买绿电的这个意愿还不是那么的强烈。所以这方面就是说，我们中国实际上还是要从供应侧如何让更加这种统一的标准的规则，通过绿电交易的方式来让新能源参与市场。然后另外一方面就是这个从用户侧的角度来说，类似于就像美国很多州的 RPS 这样的规则，那么我们能不能把中国现在国务院对于省级政府的新能源消纳权重的这样的一个考核的要求，变成所有市场主体要承担的这种消纳绿电的这样一个义务。那这样一来的话，实际上我们中国这个从需求侧发力来推动电力系统脱碳的这个动力和这个可持续机制，才会能够真正建立起来。我想要分享的就是这样一个内容。好，很期待后面的这个专家的分享和讨论，谢谢。
OK，我将共享我的这个屏幕。 OK，那么接下来我将分享一下，哎。那么接下来我将分享一下我的这个今天的这个关于这个中国电力部门的这个key opportunity 的一些想法。但事实上就是刚才三位嘉宾已经就是对整个美国或者是中美，然后包括中国本身的这个 opportunity 做了一个非常全面的一个介绍。那么我想从我自己本身的自己关注的领域，我本身的这个背景是atmospheric science， 所以我希望就是从这个协同政策的角度去谈一下 decarbonization 这个中国的电力系统。然后首先我想给一些这个背景。那我们知道这个在中国这个煤电的基础设施的发展非常的迅速。那么我们在大量规模化的新建是处在2010年左右，那么也就是说，到2020年左右，中国现役的煤电机组平均的服役年限大概是11年，其中服役年限小于这个15年的煤电机组超过了75%。那么也就意味着中国的很多机组其实是非常新的，那么他们如果面临大规模的淘汰，在当前面临大规模淘汰，事实上是有很大的 stranded assets 的风险。那么另外一点呢，就是区别于这个以这个fossil fuel 中 natural gas 或者是说 oil 为 base 的这种机组，我们煤电的这个机组呢，它其实虽然说我们做了大量的这个超低排放改造的工作，卓有成效。但是煤电主导的电力结构仍然使中国的这个污染物是不容忽视的。我们可以看到，以2020年为例，这个2020年煤电对全国人为元二氧化碳、二氧化硫氮黄的贡献仍然高达35%、15%和15%。那么也就意味着，我们仍然在煤电的这种decarbonize 的这种压力之下，我们还有一个这个 air quality improvement 的这种 pressure。所以说呢，在这样的一个背景下，煤电的退出，事实上一方面要实现未来的一个气候目标，那么对于中国来讲，包括这个碳中和的目标、碳达峰的目标，那么在对于全球来讲，我们可以 achieving 这个1.5度的这个目标。那么对于这个保障人群健康来讲，是因为这个中国这人口密度非常大，那么这种煤电无论是煤电还是说其他这种人为源的排放，它实际上都会带来较大的这种健康风险。那么我们通常会用这种mortality 去评估这种这个人群过早死亡的这种风险。那么另外一点，我刚才也提到了，就是事实上我们国家的这个煤电的这个机组，事实上是结构是非常年轻的。那么如果在 short term 就是这种短期的去淘汰这种煤电，它事实上必然面临着更大的一个资产搁浅的风险。那么另外一点呢，就是我们事实上就是在煤电和这个可再生能源的这种衔接和转型上，那么我们也是会出现这种非常强的一种能源安全的一个挑战。那么对于国家的层面来讲，那么能源安全是非常非常重要的一个国家稳定和社会稳定的一个方面。所以说，那如果说我们进行大规模的煤电的淘汰的话，它势必会带来这种严峻的资产搁浅和这种能源安全的一个风险。那么也同样来讲，但是对于煤电现在的这个结构来讲，它是储存着大量的这种基础设施的锁定排放，而且它已经威胁到了这个1.5度全球的这个1.5度的目标。所以说我们现在就是说煤电的减退的必要性是非常明确的。因为我们要实现这个气候目标，但是它带来的这种风险也是我们不容忽视的。我们可以看到资产搁浅和能源挑战，这些事实上对于我们国家的这种稳定性发展，事实上是有非常大的一个挑战的。那么所以说呢，因为习总书记也在多次的这种讲话中提到了这种减污降碳协同，也就是说，在中国近期以这种空气质量为导向的这种目标，或者是说这种压力之下，我们事实上如果能够把致力于减缓气候变化的煤电退役的政策，同时考虑这种health 的或者是这种 air pollution 的这种 improvement， 那会带来这种 co-benefits。那么这个刚才这个在这个Mike 的报告中也提到了这种 health base 的这种 这种 regulate， 所以说我们有大量的研究开始去关注这个煤电行业它的协同治理能够带来怎么样的一个效益。那么我们现在近期也在一直不断的在国内去推广，或者是说在国内去提倡的这种政策，就是说我们如何把这种健康协同的效益纳入到煤电退役的政策来，然后以实现保护人群健康，并且用最小的成本去实现最大的一个减缓煤电的一个退役，然后促进煤电的安全有序的退出和协同效益的一个最大化。这样的话，我们能够用最小的代价去解决环境问题和气候问题。那么对于近期来讲，我们认为最大的一个机会在于 targeted， 因为我做了很多这种煤电行业的这种靶向治理的一个研究。那么无论从全球的角度还是从中国的角度，尤其是在对于发展中国家来讲，我们可以看到一个非常强的一个 opportunity， 尤其是 short term 的这种 opportunity 是这种 targeted coal-fired power plants freeze out pathway design， 就是说我们再把这些所有的机组，可以看到这张图里面，我们把所有的机组的排放和 health impact 去locate 到这个 plot 这个图里面，我们可以看到就是它的这个 range， 就是排放的 range 和这个就是单位排放的 range 或者是单位排放造成的健康影响，它事实上的这个范围是非常大的。那也就意味着，那么在这里面机组的差别化的对待，那么也就意味着我们可以提出更强的一个有针对性的一个策略。那么从设施层面去开展，也符合我国当前的这个精准化治理的一个需求。那么我们去通过定量煤电减退的这个设施尺度的健康效益，我们发现啊，就是在 less than 这个2%，也就是少于2%的 coal power generation， 就是说小于2%的发电量，可能就是这一些机组只承担了全国2%的发电量，但是他们会不成比例的排放超过20%的污染物带来的这种健康影响，也就是说超过20%的 health losses。那么也就是说，如果我们要寻求一个 cost effective way， 或者是说不影响这种就是在这种安全有序的退出下，但同时能够释放这个煤电以这个健康协同为效益的这个潜力的话，我们就能够实现，就能够在短期内实现煤电的一个就是decarbonization 和这个 air pollution improvement， 因为这一些对这个 less 2%的这个机组，它不仅造成了超过20%的 health losses， 事实上由于它的发电标煤耗较高，所以它对于这个二氧化碳的贡献也能够达到近10%左右。所以说这个事实上是对于我们近期来讲，如果煤电不能大规模退出，还要以保证能源安全为这个前提的条件下，我们探寻的最优的一个路径，就是用最小的代价怎么去实现煤电的 retirement， 但是又对整个能源系统的又不会产生很大的一个冲击。所以我们提出了这个以高污染机组作为突破口，去开展这种靶向的治理，然后以寻求煤电机组最优的一个退役路径。那么我们认为，在这个2030年之前，就是中国的这个大规模退出，实际上是不太现实的，因为它那个可再生能源的发展，尤其是可再生能源的 flexible 的这种特征，它事实上无法保证我们的能源安全。所以说，煤电在中国来讲，它还是起到一个非常主力的一个煤电的一个这个提供 power 这种 generation 的一个作用。所以说，我们认为就是在这个未来就是中短期内，我们还得依靠这种所谓的这个清洁空气的政策去推动这个煤电行业的一个transformation。但是在2030年到2060年的这个阶段，然后我们还是得要靠 decarbonization， 也就是说在碳中和目标的驱动下去尽快的实现 deep decarbonization of the power plants。所以说这个是我们认为现在对中国来讲是比较 feasible 的一条路径，或者是说我们把我们的研究也放眼到这种全球的这种发展中国家，我们也发现发展中国家有同样的一个压力和同样的一个问题，就是同样面临着 air pollution 和这个 climate change。那么我们对印度的分析，包括对 rest of Asia， 尤其是这种东南亚国家这种 emerging country 的分析，也同样表明了他们可以利用最小的代价去实现最大的一个 decarbonization， 就是或者是说 air pollution improvement， 那就是去实现这种 targeted opportunity， 去寻求这种 targeted opportunity， 然后去实现这种 freeze out。那么对于发达国家来讲，我们的分析也表明，这个发达国家由于这个尤其像美国啊、欧盟，那么他们的这个机组水平已经相对来说比较先进了机组的差异不会存在着这种就是我们可以看到这个量级基本上都是到4到5个量级的差别。那么这种来讲，他们美国或者是说欧盟，他们更多的还是以这个如何从 climate change 的角度去实现煤电的 decarbonization， 而对我们来讲，我们可以先记住这个 air pollution improvement 的 action 去实现这个煤电的一个这个有序的一个退出。那么我现在就是从我们的研究的本身的角度去提出这 preliminary 的 policy recommendation is。就是我们可以去设计和这个补充 targeting 的这个 strategy， 然后在我们的协同的路径上，然后 with decarbonization， 然后包括这种提早的退役这种 super polluting units， 然后可以释放它的这种协同的潜力，同时实现安全有序的一个退出。第二个就是我们把这种 facility level 的这种各种这样的因素，比如说 technical 的，然后 cost 的strand assets 的，什么 environmental effect 或者是 climate impact， 我们能否都纳入到这种系统性的政策的这个 assessment， 然后帮助我们去建立一个 index， 然后去按这个 index 去有序的去 transformation 这些机组，而不是像现在或者是说以机组或者是单纯的以地区为导向，那么它是不够精准的一个路径。那么第三个方面，我们认为在这种 pathway 的上面，其实中国跟这个发展中国家有很多的相似之处，那么尤其是面临着climate change 和这种 air pollution 同样面临着这两个问题的一个国家，那么我们认为我们的研究是，或者是说我们现在的这种 policy 的 recognition 是非常有针对性的，它是以保护人群健康，尤其是这些国家还面临着大量的人口的增长和这个人口的这种密度较高。那么，如果把这个 the protection of the public health 作为这个我们的这个协同控制的这种start point， 我们觉得是非常有 useful 的，然后也是非常有这个针对性的，然后也是非常就是可以实现这个最大化的一个这个效益啊。今天这个就是我的一个分享，好，谢谢。
Evening. Thank all of you all the panelists for your helpful remarks. Now reach the time in the program where we will return to audience questions and answers. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please add it to the Q&A field located at the base of your screen. As the moderator, I'll take the pleasure of asking the first question that sort of comes to my mind as an ex-California state official and also as a member of the California China Climate Institute. And that is the basic question of what are your recommendations, all four of you, for what California or other similarly situated states can do in terms of climate issues, and particularly in terms of their interaction with the provinces. Other subnational governments play. So again, how do we drive the power sector transformation, particularly in terms of how can California be part of that process, both in the US and in China? So please, I'd like to turn to our four participants to answer that question.
As a Californian, maybe I can offer some thoughts first, and then I mean, California is an international leader on renewable energy integration. The California ISO has successfully integrated levels of solar penetration, both rooftop and utility scale, that went further and faster than just about any other country or state. It is a state. It does act like a country sometimes, but I believe has more battery storage now online than any other country or state. And so I think there are lots of technical achievements that the California grid has, grid operators, the regulators, et cetera, have to share with other countries, other states in the United States, continuing to lead and increase ambition as well, and then demonstrate that it's possible. I think those are the ways that California can continue to impact well beyond its borders.
Please go ahead. Who's next? Max?
Professor Tong or Well, I'll disagree with what Mike says. I think the California China Institute is a great
好
idea.
的。
It's doing great work.
就是有一个问题是关于这个经过11、5、12伟大规模淘汰之后，中国落后和高污染机组的已经不多了，基本都是高效清洁的。这个我非常同意，这个我来回应一下这个问题。就是我是非常同意这个观点的，就是说已经是非常高效清洁了。但事实上我们这里面说的 super polluting 的概念其实是一个相对的概念。它所谓的相对的概念是我们即使说所有的机组就是在整个 average 的这种水平都是高效和清洁之后，但是我们仍然存在这种就是这个小的和这个小的比较就是稍微 relative dirty 的和这种大的这种clean 的，就是就是还是能够看到这种在单位发电量上的这种 air pollution 的这种差别还是有一定存在的。那么这种存在就会给我们带来这种 targeted opportunity， 就是我们还是可以优先去淘汰这种稍微落后一点的或者稍微高污染一点的机组。所以我们这里面所谓的这种高污染或落后的机组，它是一个相对的概念，它还是跟这种大规模clean 的这种机组去比的，并不是说它就是相对于这个11.5和12.5改造之前，它还是非常的 dirty。事实上，我们的这个结论也是基于这个已经是经过大规模11.5和12.5我们改造的一个结论。所以说，我们是非常同意，就是基本上大部分都是高效清洁的。但我们认为，就是说还是能够去靶向的治理这1%或者2%的机组，它还是能够带来非常强的一个不成比例的一个污染控制的一个效益。所以说，我们还是就是提出这种所谓的targeted opportunity。好，谢谢。
Thank you. Max, you want to pick up on this question of California, what we should be doing, or?
I'll just finish up that thought that the Institute is doing a great job and glad to have this forum. I think California does already, to answer your question, does already come up in international discussions all the time. And there are a lot of useful examples that have been certainly part of our discussions in China but in other countries around the world. So I would say in general to let's keep that trend going. Thanks.
Great. In terms of, we have another question about basically building infrastructure for renewed, and in terms of how do we deal with the negative impacts on wildlife in areas where large energy structures are built, and people have specifics on how to mitigate the impacts?
Well, I'll jump in. Not my area of specialty, though. I'll point out that it is the issue of land use is already a hot topic, certainly in the US. I think also fair to say in China, and it will become more and more of a hot topic as the clean energy transition proceeds. There are various studies that look at maps of land use and the amount of land that could be considered for example, wind or solar development under different scenarios. And there are efforts to consider. I think I saw one of Germany just recently that if there was an assessment that if protected land or possible investments near protected land are left out, then that does leave fairly small parts of the country eligible for investment, and it will become an issue for building out the capacity in the coming decade or two. And that's certainly true in the US as well.
Another big question is in terms of generally, do you see opportunities for technical exchange and mutual learning between the US and China? And what are the topics that should be given the highest priority in those discussions?
“那我来说几句吧，就是中国和加州之间的这种技术交流，其实本来是有很 很悠久的历史了啊。无论是在这个个人层面、机构层面和政府层面，其实都有非常悠久的历史。那么我想，实际上在中国，在当前这样一个，比如说今年这个夏天，实际上是特别炎热的，去年也依然如此。也就是说，实际上现在这个气候变化已经变成我们生活的方方面面的时候，我觉得实际上中美两国还是非常有必要这个承担起各自的责任和领导力。其实，在前面的这个讨论当中，大家都提到了两个很敏感的议题，比如说中国的煤电的问题，和美国也有很多的州不愿意退出煤电，包括美国也在继续新建天然气发电，也就是说从这个资源充裕度、短期资源充裕度的考虑。那么我觉得实际上在这个应对全球气候变化，就是说我们终极的这个电力系统脱碳的路径、形态和资源组合到底是什么？到底是有哪些选择？其实我觉得，中国也好，美国也好，包括欧洲也好，我觉得到目前为止都还不太有我们说是真正的终极的答案。比如说，我们在中国的国内，我们在讨论这几年欧洲的比较好的一些进展，比如说德国或者说英国比较好的一些进展的时候，但是我们也要关注到，比如说欧洲这个大电网的这样一个互联互通的作用，包括实际上在整个欧洲现在这种传统的可调节可供电源依然是它这个整个系统最大负荷的1.3到1.5倍，也就是说，欧洲实际上还是在有非常大的资源充裕度的情况之下，它去推进转型。但是去年的俄乌战争，然后这个俄气危机所引发的这个欧洲对于天然气的一些担忧之后，马上就发现，实际上在欧洲这个能源市场，包括这个能源转型，就可能会遇到一些短期这些拖折。尽管中长期它的目标实际上是在加速的，所以我觉得实际上这可能不只是中国和加州或中国和美国之间的这个合作的问题，实际上这是一个全球大家要共同来去探讨适合的这样一个转型的路径、技术方案，包括应该构建怎样的一套治理和监管的体系来这个脱碳的问题。我觉得在这个过程当中，每一个国家都可能没有办法完全靠自己的能力去做出这样一个系统的一个安排，这实际上本身就是全球的事儿，实际上是需要通过很多的双边的或者说多边的这样一个机制来解决。但是我觉得现在最大的一个问题是，我们在多边机制的框架之下，实际上没有真正达成多边机制应该实现的这样一个功能。比如说这个，无论是这个技术援助也好，还是资金也好，还是这个对于这种损失损害的这种适应也好，我觉得都还没有。那么放在中国的这个具体的一个情况来看，这2年实际上这个不管是21年还是22年，还有今年，如果云南再继续这个干旱长期缺水的话，那很有可能会影响到广东，也就是我们广东经济中心的这样一个安全可靠供电的问题。那么所以实际上这一类的问题，可能就更加凸显了我们不仅仅要讨论这个我们应对气候变化，通过建设这个更多的新能源，或者说可再生能源系统，加速能源转型来适应气候变化。我们实际上更多的要把减缓的这样来减缓气候变化，更多的要把这个适应这样一些角色要考虑进去。比如说，我们实际上这个一旦出现这种40-50天的这种长期的干旱缺水之后，那么很显然我们是没有办法去保证我们的电力系统，包括我们的这种用电负荷，还像过去的business as usual 那样的一种状态之下来正常满足。那么这个时候我们需要建立什么样的一个机制，来优先保证哪些负荷，来优先保证经济社会的最大可能的这种正常的这样一种运行和发展。那么这里面实际上是需要我们要集合这种能源系统、这个气候部门、气象部门，包括这个各级政府和这种电力企业走到一起来去找解决方案。这个可能已经是突破了我们单独的一个能源电力行业自身所能解决的问题。我可能说的不一定是这个问题所要问的东西，但是就有这点感想或者说评论吧。谢谢。
No, well, thank you very much. I think we've actually come to the end of the time for our audience questions, and we now need to wrap things up. And I would like to introduce Ms. Cynthia Ye to offer some closing remarks. Please go ahead.
Oh, hello. Can you see me? Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And first, please let me to congratulations for completion of such comprehensive report. We always say power system is very localized, and such comparison is very necessary for the policymaker and the stakeholder to understand each other. But throughout the process and throughout the discussion, we indeed say there's a lot of challenge for decarbonize the power system, including the phase down, phase out of coal power, and how to set up the really functional market mechanism. And also just the transition is more and more important. For EFC, for Energy Foundation China, we really hope to support the whole process, to increase the international collaboration, and to target all the problems and the issues we discussed today, and we're really hoping for support of the process. And as I also mentioned, the climate issue get more and more serious, and we need to maybe more suitable for the change of climate. Maybe a little bit of suggestion for in the future modeling is maybe in the future we can really do some pressure test to see what is extreme, what if the really draw the condition happened, such as in China, and what is the best way to react to such of the condition. Maybe in the future we can discuss more with you on further collaboration. And again, congratulations for all the report. And also thank you for all the participants. It's really help at my end. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you very much for your support. I'd like to thank all of our panelists as well as the audience members for joining this program today, and to thank you for your engagement and questions. Obviously, we could have used more time, but again, I think it's, ongoing dialogue is very important. This event has been recorded and will later be available on the California China Climate Institute website and YouTube channels. Have a good morning or evening. Thank you again.